The pitchfork clattered to the barn floor as Hank Cordweller froze mid-motion, his weathered hands trembling at what lay nestled in the hay bales. A girl no more than 16, with tangled auburn hair and clothes torn to shreds, curled in two. A ball like a wounded animal. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, and dried blood crusted along a gash on her forehead. "Sweet merciful heaven," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. The girl's eyes fluttered open, startling green orbs that held depths of terror and desperation that made his heart clench. "Please," she croaked, her voice barely audible. Don't send me back." Hank's calloused palm hovered over her fevered brow. In the 18 months since his wife Cordelia had passed from consumption, he'd spoken to precious few souls in the remote valley of Millbrook Hollow. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles through dense Kentucky woodland, and the townsfolk had long since given up on the hermit, who'd retreated to his farm after burying the only woman he'd ever loved. "Back where, child?" he asked gently, noting how she flinched at his movement. "The workhouse," she breathed, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. They do terrible things. I ran for 3 days. 3 days through. The mountains. The Millbrook County workhouse. Hank knew the story's orphaned children worked to death. Beaten for the smallest infractions, fed scraps that wouldn't satisfy a barn cat. He'd never seen it himself, living as he did on the far edge of civilization. But the tales that drifted through the valley painted pictures that would make the devil himself weep. "What's your name?" he asked, carefully lifting her to a sitting. "Position against the hay bales." "Grace," she whispered. "Grace Emberlin." "Well, Grace Emberlin, you're safe now." The words came out before he could stop them, surprising him with their conviction. He hadn't felt protective of anyone since Cordelia's. The final breath had rattled in her chest. Grace's eyes widened. "You won't turn me in?" Hank studied her face, the determined set of her jaw, despite her obvious fear. The way her small hands had instinctively clenched into fists even in her weakened state. This was a fighter, a survivor. Something in her reminded him of Cordelia's. Fierce spirit, though his late wife had never known such hardship. "The way I see it," he said slowly, "you never made it this far. Probably got lost in the woods and perished from exposure. Terrible shame, really." A ghost of a smile flickered across Grace's lips. "And if someone comes looking, well, they'll find a grieving widower who hasn't seen hide nor hair of any runaway girls. Just me and my crops and my livestock, same as always." He stood, brushing hay from his knees. "But first, we need to get you cleaned up and fed. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in months." As he helped her to her feet, Grace stumbled against him, and he caught her easily. For a moment, they stood frozen in the dusty barn light streaming through the gaps in the boards. Something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or the first flutter of something deeper that neither was ready to name. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk everything for a stranger?" Hank looked down at her upturned face, seeing not just desperation now, but hope beginning to kindle in those remarkable green eyes. "Maybe," he said quietly, "because we both need saving." 3 weeks later, Grace stood at the kitchen window, watching Hank repair the chicken coop fence, her reflection ghost-like in the morning glass. The hollow cheeks had filled out, the cuts had healed 2 thin pink lines, but the transformation ran deeper than physical recovery. For the first time in years, she felt human again. "The eggs are burning," came Hank's voice from behind her. She spun around, face flushing as she rushed to the skillet. "I'm sorry, I was just watching me make a fool of myself with that stubborn fence post," he finished, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. At 42, Hank still moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, though grief had carved lines around his dark eyes that spoke of long, lonely nights. "You're not foolish," Grace said, sliding the slightly charred eggs onto his plate. "You're not capable. I've never known anyone so capable." The compliment hung in the air between them, heavier than it should have been. Hank cleared his throat and sat at the rough-hewn table Cordelia had insisted he'd build when they'd first married. "Grace," he began carefully, "we need to talk about your future." Her hand stilled on the coffee pot. "My future?" Winter's coming. Folks will start visiting more, checking on the old hermit, bringing preserves and gossip. It won't be safe for you to stay hidden much longer. Grace set the pot down with trembling fingers. I understand. I'll pack my things. No. The word came out sharper than he intended. That's not what I meant. She turned to face him, hope and fear warring in her expression. I've been thinking, Hank continued, running his thumb along the rim of his coffee cup. Cordelia always wanted children. We tried for years, but the Lord had different plans. Maybe this is his way of answering old prayers. What are you saying? I'm saying you could stay permanently as my... He paused, the words catching in his throat. As my ward, my adopted daughter. I'd give you my name, my protection. You'd be a Cordweller, with all the rights and respect that brings. In these parts, Grace sank into the chair across from him, tears streaming down her face. Hank, there's just one problem, he said quietly. The way I've been looking at you lately. It's not how a father looks at his daughter. The admission hung between them like a struck bell reverberating through the small kitchen. Grace's breath caught, and she saw her own confused feelings reflected in his troubled gaze. I know you're barely 18, he continued. I know I'm old enough to be your father, and I know it's wrong to feel this way about someone I should be protecting. But I can't lie to you, Grace. I won't start this relationship, whatever it becomes with deception. Grace reached across the table, her small hand covering his work-roughened one. You saved my life, Hank. But more than that, you gave me back my dignity, my hope. Do you think I haven't noticed the way you watch me, the way you make excuses? To touch my hand when you pass me the dishes? His eyes widened. Grace, do you think I haven't felt my heart skip when you smile at me? When you say my name like it's something precious? She squeezed his fingers. I'm not a child, despite what the world has tried to make me. I've seen enough cruelty to recognize kindness, enough hatred to recognize love. Love, the word escaped him like a prayer. I love you, Hank Cordweller. Not as a daughter loves a father, not as a grateful orphan loves her savior, but as a woman loves a man, completely, desperately, without reservation. Stood abruptly pacing to the window where she'd been standing moments before. It's not, right? People will talk. They'll say I took advantage. People will always talk. But we know the truth. She rose and moved to stand behind him. The question is, what do we want our truth to be? Hank turned in her arms, his hands framing her, faced with infinite gentleness. I want you to be mine, Grace. My wife, my partner, my equal in all things. But I need to know you're choosing this freely, not out of gratitude or fear of being alone. She stood on her tiptoes, her lips barely brushing his. I'm choosing love, Hank. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing love. The autumn wind rattled. The windows of Millbrook Hollow's only church as Reverend Josiah Weatherby cleared his throat nervously. Behind him, the small congregation buzzed with whispered speculation about the unlikely couple standing before the altar. Dearly beloved, the Reverend began, his voice echoing off the weathered wooden walls. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Hank Cordweller and Grace Emberlin in holy matrimony. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she held the simple bouquet of wildflowers Hank had picked for her that morning. She wore Cordelia's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame of gesture. Hank had suggested that had initially felt strange, but now seemed like a blessing from beyond. The ivory silk, though yellowed with age, transformed her into something ethereal. In the 18 years I've known Hank, Reverend Weatherby continued, casting a meaningful look at the few dozen gathered townspeople, I have watched him endure trials that would break lesser men. Today I see that same steadfast devotion directed toward this young woman who has captured his heart. In the front pew, Minerva Blackthorne, the town's unofficial keeper of morals, pursed her lips disapprovingly. Behind her, Dr. Fitzgerald and his wife exchanged concerned glances. The age difference was apparent, certainly, but it was more than that. Grace carried herself with a poise that seemed at odds with her supposed 17 years. And her eyes held depths that spoke of experiences no young woman should have endured. Hank felt the weight of their judgment and squeezed Grace's hand reassuringly. He'd expected this reaction when he'd ridden into town 3 days earlier to post the banns and arrange the ceremony. The whispers had followed him through the general store, the blacksmith shop, the tavern. A hermit widower marrying a girl young enough to be his daughter? Scandalous didn't begin to cover it, but one person had surprised him. Hank Cordweller, old Doc Fitzgerald, had called out as he loaded supplies into his wagon. The elderly physician approached with his characteristic limp, a souvenir from the war. "Heard you're taking a wife." "That's right, Doc." "Good for you." The older man had clapped him on the shoulder. "Man wasn't meant to live alone. Dear Cordelia, God rest her soul, would want you to find happiness again." Now, as the Reverend asked for any objections to the union, that same supportive voice called out from the congregation. "I object," declared Minerva Blackthorne, rising to her feet with righteous indignation. A collective gasp rippled through the church. Grace's face paled, but Hank stepped protectively closer to her. "On what grounds?" Reverend Weatherby asked, though his tone suggested he dreaded the answer. "On the grounds that this girl appeared out of nowhere, with no family, no references, no history. How do we know she's not some opportunist preying on our Hank's grief?" "Because," came another voice from the back of the church, "she's exactly what she appears to be."
All
Heads turned to see a stranger striding down the aisle, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and expensive clothes that marked him as someone of importance. Grace's face went white as moonlight. "And who might you be?" Reverend Weatherby inquired. "Judge Cornelius Vance, from the county seat. I've been tracking a runaway from the Millbrook workhouse for the past month." His eyes locked on Grace. "Miss Emberlin, I presume?" The church fell silent, except for the wind whistling through the eaves. Grace lifted her chin defiantly, though Hank could feel her trembling beside him. "Now see here," Hank began, but Judge Vance held up a hand. "Before anyone says anything they might regret," the judge continued, "you should know that my investigation has uncovered some very interesting facts about the conditions at that workhouse. Facts that have resulted in its immediate closure and the arrest of its superintendent." Minerva Blackthorne sank back into her pew, her mouth falling open. "It seems," Judge Vance continued, walking closer to the altar, "that Miss Emberlin and 17 other children were victims of systematic abuse, including forced labor, starvation, and ... double quotes." He paused meaningfully. "Other cruelties I won't mention." In polite company, Grace's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her cheeks as years of suppressed trauma threatened to overwhelm her. "Furthermore," the judge said gently, "Miss Emberlin was never legally committed to that institution. She was placed there illegally after her parents died in the cholera epidemic of 1847. She has every right to choose her own path in life." He turned to address the entire congregation. "I came here today not to arrest a runaway, but to apologize to a brave young woman who survived unconscionable treatment and to witness what appears to be a union based on genuine affection and mutual respect." Reverend Weatherby smiled broadly. "In that case, shall we continue with the ceremony?" As Grace and Hank exchanged vows, their voices strong and clear despite the emotional upheaval. Even Minerva Blackthorne found herself dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "A kiss your bride," the Reverend announced, when Hank's lips met Grace's, sealing their union before God and community. The autumn winds seemed to settle, as if even nature itself was offering its blessing to their unlikely love story. The newlyweds. First winter together tested every promise they'd made. At the altar, January brought a blizzard that lasted for days, trapping them in the cabin with dwindling supplies and only each other for company. By the third day, Grace was ready to brave the storm, just to escape the weight of Hank's worried silence. "You're thinking too loudly," she said, looking up from her mending as he stared into the fire. Hank turned from where he sat, whittling a piece of maple. "Just wondering if I made the right decision, keeping you here through the worst winter in 20 years. Where else would I be? Somewhere warmer, somewhere safer, with people your own age." He set down his knife. "Grace, I wake up every morning terrified that you'll realize you've made a terrible mistake." She set aside her sewing and moved to kneel beside his chair. "Hank Cordweller, you listen to me. I've been cold before, so cold I thought I'd never feel warmth again. I've been hungry, frightened, and alone. But I have never, not once since I said I do, regretted marrying you. Even when I leave muddy boots by the door. Even then. Even when I talk to the livestock more than I talk to you," Grace laughed. The sound brightened the firelit room. "Especially then, old Bessie gives terrible advice about women." For the first time in days, Hank smiled. "She told me I should buy you ribbons for your hair. See? Terrible advice. I'd much rather have, ... double quotes. She paused dramatically. "A book. Real book. With stories I've never read. Grace, the nearest bookstore is in Louisville. That's a 3-day ride in good weather, I know." She settled into his lap, her arms encircling his neck. "I'm not asking for miracles. I'm just telling you what would make me happy. Books, babies, and you. In that order. Babies." The word came out strangled. "Don't look so terrified. Not with child yet, but..." She traced patterns on his chest through his wool shirt. "I'd like to be. Someday." Hank was quiet for so long that Grace began to worry she'd overstepped. Finally, he spoke. "Cordelia lost 3 babies. 2 miscarriages, and 1 that lived only." Adea's voice was barely audible. "I don't know if I could survive losing you, too." Grace cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Then we'll be careful. We'll wait until I'm older, stronger. And when the time comes, we'll face it together, whatever happens." The storm broke the next morning, revealing a world transformed by snow and ice. As they worked together to dig out the barn and care for the livestock, Grace noticed how their partnership had evolved during the long, isolated days. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, anticipating each other's needs without words. "Grace." Hank called from where he was breaking ice on the water trough. "Look." She followed his gaze to see a doe and her grown fawn picking their way delicately across the snow-covered pasture, their dark forms stark against the white landscape. "They're beautiful," she breathed. "They're also probably starving. Snow's too deep for them to forage properly." He was already moving toward the barn. "Help me carry some hay to the edge of the woods." As they scattered the feed, watching the deer approach cautiously, Grace felt something shift inside her chest. This was what love looked like in practice, not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but quiet acts of care extended to creatures who couldn't repay the kindness. "Hank," she said as they walked back to the house, their breath visible in the crisp air. I want to learn to read better. Really read, not just the basic letters the workhouse taught us. And I want to learn numbers and how to keep proper accounts for the farm." He stopped walking and turned to study her face. "That's a fine goal. But why now?" "Because I want to be worthy of you, this life we're building together." She gestured toward the cabin, the barn, the snow-covered fields that represented their small corner of the world. "I want to be more than just a refugee you rescued. I want to be your true partner." "Grace, you already are." "No, I'm not. Not yet. But I could be if you'll teach me." That evening, as the wind howled around the cabin, Hank brought out Cordelia's Bible and a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets she'd treasured. By lamplight, he began teaching his young wife to read with the patience of a man who had found his purpose. "Sound it out," he encouraged, as Grace struggled with a particularly difficult passage. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" She read slowly. "Thou art more lovely and more temperate." "Perfect," Hank said softly, and Grace looked up too. Find him watching her with an expression that made her heart race. "What?" "Nothing. Just, I love watching you discover things. Your face lights up like sunrise when something makes sense to you." Grace closed the book and leaned back against his chest, where they sat before the fire. "Read to me now, please." As Hank's deep voice filled the cabin with poetry about love and beauty and the passage of time, Grace closed her eyes and let herself fully embrace the moment. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside their small sanctuary, spring felt like it was just around the corner. Spring arrived with a vengeance. bringing floods that washed out bridges and turned the valley roads into rivers of mud. It also brought visitors the first Grace and Hank had received since their wedding 5 months earlier. "Halloo, the house," came a cheerful voice from the yard one morning in early April. Grace looked up from where she was helping Hank plant the kitchen garden, her hands dirty and her hair escaping from its pins. A well-dressed couple was climbing down from a mud-splattered carriage, and she recognized them immediately from the wedding. "Dr. Fitzgerald," Hank called, wiping his hands on his trousers as he approached. "Mrs. Fitzgerald, what brings you all?" "The way out here? Medical emergency?" The doctor replied gravely, then broke into a grin. "I'm afraid I'm suffering from terminal curiosity about how you newlyweds are faring." His wife, Martha, swatted his arm playfully. "Don't mind him, Grace, dear. We brought you some things from town and wanted to see how you're settling in." It's over dinner, Grace found herself relaxing for the first time around strangers since her ordeal. At the workhouse, the Fitzgeralds were warm, unpretentious people who treated her as an equal rather than an oddity to be examined. "I must say," Martha confided as they cleared the dishes, "you've worked wonders with this place. I remember visiting Hank after Cordelia passed, and the poor man was barely keeping body and soul together. Now look at him, he's positively glowing." Through the window they could see Hank and the doctor examining the barn roof, their conversation animated and comfortable. "He saved my life," Grace said simply. "Perhaps, but it seems to me you've saved his as well." Martha handed Grace a wrapped package. "This is from several of the ladies in town, sort of belated wedding gift." Inside, Grace found 3 books: a collection of poetry, a treatise on household management, and a novel called Jane Eyre that made her gasp with recognition. "I've heard of this one," she said wonderingly, "but I never thought I'd actually be able to read it." "The heroine is an orphan who makes her own way in the world," Martha said meaningfully. "I thought you might appreciate her story." That evening, after the Fitzgeralds had departed for town, Grace curled up beside Hank in their bed and began reading aloud from Charlotte Bronte's masterpiece. "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me," she read, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I am a free human being with an independent will." "Sounds familiar?" Hank murmured against her hair. "Does it? Reminds me of a certain young woman who appeared in my barn last autumn, demanding freedom and a future." Grace marked her place in the book and turned to face him in the lamplight. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't? Run away? If I'd stayed at the workhouse and died there like so many others?" "No," Hank said firmly. "I don't wonder about that because it didn't happen. You're here, you're mine, and you're safe. That's all that matters." But Grace wasn't ready to let the subject go. "Right. Dr. Fitzgerald told me something today while you were showing him the new foal. He said there's talk in town about expanding the railroad through this valley." Hank stiffened. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that involves buying up farms and paying good money for land near where the tracks will run. And I think we should consider it." Hank sat up abruptly, his expression stunned. "Grace, this land has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather cleared these fields with his bare hands. My father built this house. Cordelia is buried in the grove beyond the pasture. I know all of that." Grace sat up as well, her bare shoulders gleaming in the lamplight. "But Hank, think about what we could do with that money. We could travel, see the world beyond this valley. We could buy a house in town where I could teach other children to read. Could have adventures." "Adventures?" He looked at her as if she'd suggested they sprout wings and fly. "Grace, this is our home." "No," she said gently. "This was your home with Cordelia. I'm asking you to help me build something new, something that's ours alone." The conversation ended in their first real argument, with Hank sleeping in the guest room and Grace lying awake wondering if she'd pushed too hard, too fast. But the next morning, she found him sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a thoughtful expression. "Tell me more about this teaching idea," he said without preamble. Grace's heart leaped, but she kept her voice steady. "There are children in town who can't read beyond their own names. Children from families too poor to send them to the proper school. I could help them. I want to see the ocean, Hank. I want to visit cities where women can attend universities and lectures in art galleries. I want to learn everything I can and bring it back to share with others." Hank was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. slow, devastating smile that had captured her heart. "Well then, Mrs. Cordweller," he said, standing and pulling her into his arms, "I suppose we'd better start planning our grand adventure." As Grace kissed her husband, tasting coffee and possibility on his lips, she realized that love wasn't just about finding safety, it was about finding someone brave enough to leap into the unknown beside you. The railroad representatives arrived in Millbrook Hollow like a plague of locusts in expensive suits, measuring and surveying and making grand promises about progress and prosperity. By midsummer, half the valley's farmers had signed contracts to sell their land, and the other half were holding town meetings to debate the merits of change versus tradition. Grace stood at the back of Paulson's general store during one such meeting, watching her husband field questions from neighbors who'd known him all his life. Hank called out Ezra Millwright, the valley's oldest resident. "Your daddy would roll over in his grave if he knew you were thinking about selling Cordweller land to a bunch of city speculators." "Maybe," Hank replied calmly. "Or maybe he'd understand that sometimes a man has to choose between honoring the past and securing the future." "And what future would that be?" demanded Minerva Blackthorne, who had become slightly less hostile to Grace over the winter but still regarded her with suspicion. Grace stepped forward before Hank could answer. "A future where every child in this valley can read and write and cipher. A future where young people don't have to choose between staying ignorant on the farm or leaving everything they love behind to find opportunity in the cities." The room buzzed with murmurs, some approving, others skeptical. "Pretty words from a girl who's been here less than a year," Minerva said pointedly. "True," Grace acknowledged, refusing to be baited. "But I've seen what happens when people have no choices, no education, no hope of bettering their circumstances. I've lived in that darkness, and I won't watch it happen to the children here." Old Doc Fitzgerald stood up slowly, his joints creaking audibly. "I've been thinking about what young Grace said at the last meeting, about starting a proper school. It's not just the little reading lessons we give the children on Sundays, but real education. Mathematics, history, literature, even basic. Medicine and law." "Fine idea, Doc," said Ezra. "But who's going to pay for it? And who's going to teach it?" Dr. Fitzgerald smiled. "Well, as to the first question, I believe several of our farmers are about to come into considerable railroad money. As to the second, ... he gestured toward Grace. "I propose we hire Mrs. Cordweller as our first teacher." Room erupted in debate. Grace felt her cheeks burn as voices rose around her, some supportive, others dismissive. She's barely more than a child herself. But she reads better than half the adults in this room. What does she know about teaching? What did any of us know about farming before we learned it? Through it all, Grace kept her eyes fixed on Hank, who was watching her with a mixture of pride and concern. When the noise finally died down, he stood up. "I think," he said clearly, "we should put it to a vote. All in favor of establishing a proper school, with Grace Cordweller as teacher, raise your hands." Grace held her breath. As hands slowly rose around the room, Dr. Fitzgerald and his wife, several of the younger farmers with small children, even Reverend Weatherby, who had been silent until now. When the count was finished, the motion had passed by 3 votes. "Well then," said Ezra Millwright, shaking his head but smiling slightly, "I guess we're in the education business." That night, Grace and Hank walked hand in hand through their soon-to-be former property, saying goodbye to favorite spots and making plans for their new life. "Are you sure about this?" Grace asked as they paused beside Cordelia's grave in the small family cemetery. "It's about selling the land or about my wife becoming the valley's schoolmarm? Both?" Hank knelt and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers. On the weathered headstone, Cordelia always said this valley needed more teachers and fewer farmers. She'd be proud of what you're planning to do. And you proud of me? Stood and pulled her close, his hands tangling in her hair. "Grace Cordweller, I am so proud of you I can barely breathe sometimes. You've taken a broken-down widower and a handful of broken dreams and turned them into something beautiful." "We did that together," she corrected. "Yes, we did." He kissed her forehead gently. "And now we're going to build something even better." The railroad money came through in September, more than either of them had dared hope for. October, They'd purchased a modest house in town and begun converting the large front parlor into a classroom. Grace threw herself into preparations with the intensity of a general planning a campaign, ordering primers and slates and maps from catalogs, designing lesson plans, and interviewing prospective students. On the first day of school, 15 children ranging in age from 6 to 16 filed nervously into the makeshift classroom. Grace stood at the front, her heart hammering against her ribs, remembering her own hunger for knowledge and the years it had been denied to her.
"Good morning, class,"
she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "My name is Mrs. Cordweller, and I'm here to help you learn to read, write, and think for yourselves. But first, I want each of you to tell me something you've always wanted to know about the world." A small boy in the front row raised his hand eagerly. "Why do birds fly south in winter?" A girl near the back spoke up shyly. "Are there really libraries with thousands of books?" An older boy, nearly as tall as Grace herself, asked, "How do you build a bridge that won't fall down?" As the questions poured out about distant countries, scientific discoveries, historical events, and philosophical puzzles, Grace felt the same electric thrill she'd experienced that first night reading. Poetry with Hank. This was what she'd been born to do, to kindle the flame of curiosity in young minds and feed it with knowledge. "Well then," she said, smiling broadly at her eager students, "we have a lot of work to do." 5 years later, Grace stood at the window of her classroom watching the morning train pull into Millbrook Hollow's new station, its whistle echoing off the hills that surrounded the growing town. The railroad had brought change beyond anyone's expectations, new businesses, new families, new opportunities that transformed the sleepy farming community into a bustling hub of commerce and culture. "Mrs. Cordweller?" a voice interrupted her. "Reverie." She turned to see Lucy Henshaw, one of her first students, now 17, and serving as her assistant teacher. "Yes, Lucy. The new students from the train are here for their interviews. The family from Chicago with the 3 children?" Grace nodded, smoothing her skirts as she prepared to meet the latest arrivals. Her school had grown from that first classroom of 15 local children to a proper academy with 43 students, including several whose families had relocated, specifically to take advantage of the educational opportunities Grace had created. The Chicago family, the Havenshires, were affluent city dwellers, whose textile business had expanded to include a new mill in Millbrook Hollow. Their children were polite, well-dressed, and utterly terrified of leaving their sophisticated urban world for what they clearly considered the wilderness. "I'm afraid Margaret is quite advanced in her studies," Mrs. Havenshire explained apologetically, gesturing to her 14-year-old daughter. "She's been reading Chaucer and studying Latin. I hope your little country school can accommodate her needs." Grace smiled serenely. "Margaret, would you please tell me what you thought of Chaucer's treatment of courtly love in The Knight's Tale?" The girl's eyes widened in surprise. You've read Chaucer." Here not only read it, but taught it. "We finished our unit on medieval literature last month. This term we're beginning with Shakespeare's histories." Grace turned to the younger children. "And Thomas, I see you're 8. Can you tell me what you know about mathematics?"
"Yes."
As the interview progressed, the Havenshire's condescension melted into genuine respect and eventually enthusiastic enrollment. It was a pattern Grace had grown accustomed to. City sophisticates, arriving with low expectations and departing as ardent supporters of her educational philosophy. That evening, Grace walked home through the busy streets of the transformed town, nodding to friends and former students who now worked as clerks, mechanics, and shop owners throughout the valley. The general store had expanded into a proper mercantile. There was a lending library, a telegraph office, and even a small theater where traveling companies performed Shakespeare and contemporary dramas, she found. Hank in their garden behind the house, harvesting late tomatoes in the golden light of approaching sunset. At 47, he had evolved from the isolated widower she'd first encountered into a respected member of the community, serving on the town council and managing the financial affairs of several local businesses. "How did the interviews go?" he asked, kissing her cheek as she joined him among the plants. "Very well. The Havenshire children will be excellent additions to our advanced classes." She paused, watching him carefully select the ripest fruit. "Hank, I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made him look up sharply.